the deer panteth for the water, so my soul longs after thee. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship thee. You alone are my strength, my shield. To you alone may my spirit yield. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship thee.
Shalom, dear friends. Welcome back to our new episode. We return to chapter 45, where we have one of the most emotional and memorable scenes in the entire story of the patriarch Joseph. When he makes himself known to his brothers, the love of Joseph towards his brother could no longer be kept hidden. There was an emotional outbreak of love that Joseph wanted to express. He would send all Egyptians outside and create a typical family atmosphere where he could be himself, he could express himself to his family. And it's here that we find Joseph as the model of love, forgiveness, and reconciliation. However, Joseph does not hide the actions of his brothers. Nonetheless, his words in no way give an occasion of blame. Through the actions of his brothers, he tells us God has directed every action according to divine plan and not because of human activity. By selling Joseph into slavery, it was done, of course, unwittingly. They were carrying out God's will. I would request you to look at the text, chapter 45. In 5 verses, we can notice the fourfold expression: for God sent me before you to preserve life. 5 verses from verses 5 to 9. So it was Joseph's deep love for his father that made Jacob reach Egypt and eventually settle down there. We concluded the previous episode with the preparation for the journey that Jacob undertook before he reached Egypt. We can see the spiritual preparation where he consulted God. So the final 5 chapters of Genesis, from chapter 46 to 50, in a way summarize the entire patriarchal story. The spirit and the message of the patriarchal stories can be found in these 5 chapters. The author brings the family stories of Jacob and Joseph together, and this will be a preparation for the most important event in the Old Testament. What is that? The Exodus event. The promise made by God to Jacob in chapter 46:4. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's own hand shall close your eyes. This is the foretelling of the exodus of the descendants of Jacob, which will take place 450 years later. In chapter 46, the theme is the migration of Joseph to Egypt. The narrator creates a separate section from chapter 46, verse 8 to 27, giving us a list of Jacob's descendants based on the traditional number 70, which we already discussed in the previous section. Now, from verse 28, the account of Jacob and his sons settling down in Egypt is described. The preparation for Joseph to receive his beloved father is explained in detail. In verse 29, Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to meet his father Israel in Goshen. He presented himself to him, fell on his neck, and wept on his neck a good while. A very moving expression. When they reached Goshen, Judah is sent ahead because he is the chief spokesperson, according to J. Writer. Judah. The J tradition comes from the Judah, from the land of Judah. He is the hero. The long-awaited meeting between Joseph and his father presents a very moving picture. Falling on Jacob's neck, Joseph wept for a good while, as the text said, and he will keep out all his past sorrows and pent-up emotions. Jacob's joy is complete in being reunited with his son, whom he once believed to be dead. Chapter 46, verse 30. Yes. Joseph had to present his family members to Pharaoh, and he prepared his brothers to meet Pharaoh. Desiring to have his family near him, Joseph advised his brothers to testify that they were shepherds. And this has a great nuance. Since the occupation of being a shepherd was abominable to Egyptians, Pharaoh would see the wisdom of settling them apart in the land of famine. The two names that we find here, according to one tradition, J tradition, the family of Jacob was put up in Goshen. P tradition gives the different name, Ramses. Both are found in this text. Ramses was named after Ramses II, the Pharaoh. Same place, two names. And how do you explain this expression, chapter 46, verse 34. For every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians, because of the detestable occupation. Israelites could not mix with the Egyptians. Or was it a ploy to settle down in Goshen, away from the control of the Egyptians, so the Israelites could be themselves, could be away from every control of the Egyptians? Anyway, the attitude of distrust between the settled people and the nomads is well attested in the statement, shepherds are abhorrent to the Egyptians. In chapter 47, Joseph Jacob comes to Egypt, and Joseph notifies the arrival of his brothers to Pharaoh. He took 5 of his trained brothers to meet Pharaoh. The encounter goes much better than anticipated. Goshen is given for Israelites to settle down, and he appointed as superintendents of he's appointed as superintendents of royal herds. Look at chapter 47, verse 5b, going up to 11. The final scene, the polite exchange between Pharaoh and Jacob. Please note, Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Jacob blessed Pharaoh. One who blesses is superior to the one who is blessed. Jacob does not show any sign of servility. Pharaoh, the great king of Egypt, the emperor, is blessed by Jacob. Pharaoh asks Jacob of his age. He replies, 130, which means Jacob has lived beyond the Egyptian ideal life expectancy of 110 years. Abraham lived for 175 years. Isaac, 180 years. Jacob refers to his life as a wayfarer, a term common in patriarchal narratives in chapter 17:8, 28:4, 36:7, etc. So his years had been few and hard, because there was an increasing shortening and troubling of human life. Remember, great grandfather Abraham lived for 175 years. His father lived for 180 years. So the promise remained a promise. The possession of the land remains to be fulfilled. We come to chapter 47, verse 13 to 26, the agrarian reform of Joseph in Egypt. It involved a change in the Egyptian system of land tenure. Here, the author picks up the story from chapter 41, verse 57, bringing us back to the famine. Joseph's economic policies enabled the Egyptians to survive only by selling their land to Pharaoh and becoming slaves. First, food for money. Then, food in exchange of livestock. Finally, land and one's own freedom for food. So the reform that Joseph made was beneficial to Pharaoh, but initially also saving for the people who are in famine. But there was a consequence. The result was the former landowners became tenants of Pharaoh. They farm the land and pay one fifth as tax to Pharaoh. Verse 24. According to this reform, temple lands were exempt in verse 22. The only purpose of the narrator in this section is to show Joseph as a wise and capable administrator. He is a crisis manager. He is a troubleshooter. The author does not intend to sanction the absolutism of Pharaoh or Joseph. But in the practical understanding, at least in the beginning, it was beneficial to both. The Egyptian centralized land ownership probably influenced the wise men in the court of Solomon. Remember, this probably was written after or during the reign of Solomon. The wise men in the court of Solomon advised to enlarge the royal property by imposing heavy taxation and forced labor. The story of the administrative system of Joseph was put forward to Solomon as the ideal system to enlarge the royal property. This is what Solomon did, and he had a clue from the reforms made by Joseph in the court of Pharaoh in Egypt. The Israelites were accustomed to the idea of private property. In fact, they were surprised by the Egyptian system of a centralized agrarian system. There in Egypt, almost all the land became the property of the crown. And Solomon, taking the information of the past in Egypt, he imposed taxes in kind. He instituted forced labor. And you remember, it was due to this in the history of Israel that after the death of Solomon, there was a civil war. They were they were reacting to the centralized rule of Solomon. Okay, coming back to the text, during the devastating famine, the agrarian reform brought people to Pharaoh for bread. I will highlight this aspect. Bread now becomes an instrument of subjugation. In order to feed themselves, they first bought food with the money that they had. When money was over, they surrendered the land for food. Finally, they had to surrender themselves to obtain food. Still, it is interesting to note that they were grateful to Pharaoh. On the one hand, it shows the astute and cunning reform of Joseph, and on the other, the naivety of the people to hold the emperor as almost a representative of God. Even after the despotic king made use of the people for his personal advancement, it is a sad story repeated even in modern times. Even in the modern times, the faulty and failed programs of the government causing untold suffering on people and ordinary citizens, leading them to simple penury. And administrators are capable of creating narratives which continue to deceive ordinary people. We come to Jacob's adoption and blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh from verses 27 going up to chapter 48, 22. The tradition of the last days of Jacob is found in all the three traditions of J, P, and E. According to the J tradition, Jacob's dying request to be buried with the ancestors in the land of Canaan. That's how we end chapter 47. And Jacob insists with Joseph to take an oath to bury in the family tomb, signified once bond with the ancestors. It is also a claim to the promised land that they still have to possess. So this adoption and blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh by Jacob is a historical development in the history of Israel. In verse 30 to 31, Joseph binds himself by oath to bury Jacob in his ancestors' burial place. Which is that place? We have seen that in chapter 23, Machpelah, the place where Abraham bought to bury his wife Sarah. Jacob told them, "Soon I will die. Bury me with my father and grandfather in the cave in Ephron's field." Verse 30. The cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre in Canaan, which Abraham bought from Ephron the Hittite for a permanent burial place. This oath that Joseph took has to be fulfilled, which we'll see later. Why is there is a reference to the Rachel's tomb? According to E tradition, Rachel was buried near Bethlehem, and did Jacob want to be buried with his wife together with Rachel? We come to the blessings proper. The tribe of Joseph early in history is split into two, Ephraim and Manasseh, as we find in the account of the book of Joshua and Judges, based on the divine promise given at Bethel. Earlier it was called Luz, in chapter 35, verse 9 to 13. They settled down near the mountains of Samaria and became powerful tribes in the northern kingdom, both the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. So, this adoption account is meant to show how they became powerful tribal leaders, although they were not the natural sons of Jacob. By adoption, they became the adopted sons. Actually, they are the grandsons, and the grandsons became equal to sons, just like other tribes. This is significant, and the way it is done, it is interesting. There is a second version of the adoption in chapter 48, 8 to 12. That is from the J tradition. The circumstance that the house of Joseph, given in the book of Joshua, chapter 17, came to be divided into two tribes, each claiming full rank with other tribes. We have a very colorful scene, chapter 48, verse 12 and following, like a little drama. Joseph brings Manasseh, his firstborn son, for the blessing of the right hand. So he places Manasseh, the eldest, the firstborn, in front of Jacob, in front of his right hand to bless him, because the blessing with the right hand is the proper blessing. But what does Jacob do? Jacob crosses his hand and puts his right hand on Ephraim, the younger one, giving him precedence, keeping the left, of course, on the eldest one. The narrator appeals to the ancient belief in the efficacy of the deathbed blessing to account for two facts. One, Manasseh and Ephraim were powerful in early Israelite history. Ephraim, secondly, the younger one, during the period of Judges, gained preeminence over the ones first in leadership. And their prominence in the history of Israel is attributed to the correct blessing that Jacob gave to his Joseph's younger son Ephraim. How does he give the blessing? Jacob invokes God by a threefold description. The God before whom his ancestor walked, God who has been his shepherd, God who redeemed him from evil. Let my name be perpetuated. The name, psychic life of the father was to be perpetuated by the two boys. We have another blessing of the another version of the blessing in verse 20. It is reminiscent of the promise made to Abraham in chapter 12, verse 2, where Israel is to be a blessing. By you, Israel, in chapter 12, um, Abraham is to be a blessing. And here, Israel is to be the blessing. And finally, Jacob blesses Joseph. I am about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you again to the land of your ancestors. In fact, Joseph died in Egypt and his bones were brought back to Canaan. In chapter 48, verse 22, I now give to you one portion more than to your brothers, the portion that I took from the land of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow. So this is a special blessing given. And what is this one portion? In Hebrew, it says one shoulder. Shechem in Hebrew is a play on the word Shechem. So Shechem, the important city which lay in the territory of Joseph. So with my sword and with my bow, occupation of Shechem in chapter 34. With the sword and bow, they occupied Shechem by attacking the city by the sons of Jacob. And that becomes the place of the promise for Joseph. Later in the history of Israel, the descendants of Joseph will take possession of that land of Shechem. So now, the next episode, we will conclude the book of Genesis and the last days of Jacob and finally Joseph. Till then, God be with you. Shalom.
Thank you, Lord, for the gift and love of your sacred word. Open our hearts to put into practice that which you have revealed to us through your word. Amen.